You are listening to Unseen Givens by Elton Thomas. Part 2, Chapters 5 through 8. Chapter 5, Missed Connections. Part 1, The Running Gag of Missing Ross. Back in the present, Laura sat at her desk, staring at the email she'd just received. It was a confirmation for the next big Printest meeting, a follow-up on the integration strategy with the newly acquired company. Her heart did a little leap of anticipation as she read the list of attendees. There it was. Ross Givens, founder and CEO of Givens Corp. Finally. This was going to be the day. Laura leaned back in her chair, smiling to herself, trying to rein in her expectations. It was absurd how many times she'd missed him already. Ever since her first day, it seemed like Ross Givens was everywhere but in front of her. And everyone had met him. Sharon at reception? Ross had stopped by last Tuesday just as Laura had left for lunch. Adam? He had passed Ross in the hallway multiple times, even exchanging a few pleasantries about the weather and the latest football game. Nancy? She'd had full meetings with him. Heck, even Julie, the busy lead from Printest, had run into Ross in the elevator, casually striking up a conversation as if it were no big deal. But Laura? Nothing. Not a single glimpse. It was like Ross was a phantom, a myth that everyone else was privy to but her. It was starting to become something of a legend in the office. Laura's Givens curse. People were joking about it now, but in that light-hearted, teasing way that made her frustration feel all the more absurd. Still, today was going to be different. The meeting was scheduled for tomorrow, and Ross had confirmed his attendance. Laura refused to believe that she would miss him again. Not this time. She tapped her fingers lightly against her desk, her mind wandering as she thought about all the near misses. The more she thought about it, the funnier it became. It wasn't just that she hadn't met Ross. She had almost met him. In fact, she'd been this close to meeting him several times, only to have some ridiculous obstacle get in the way. There was the time she'd arrived at the office early to prepare for a presentation, only to be told that Ross had just left after stopping by the break room for coffee. Coffee. Of course. She had probably walked past him in the hallway and didn't even know it. Then, there was the day she had stayed late, thinking she'd catch him before he left the building. She'd been in the middle of reviewing some last-minute data when Adam had poked his head into her office. His face lit up with excitement. "You just missed him," he had said, his voice full of enthusiasm. "Ross was in the elevator on his way out. I tried to grab you, but you were on the phone." Laura had almost thrown her pen across the room. How was it possible to miss someone so consistently? It was like the universe was conspiring against her, placing Ross just out of reach every single time. Even now, as she sat in her office, she could hear snippets of conversation from her colleagues outside. They were talking about Ross again, casually mentioning having seen him around the office earlier that morning. "Yeah, I ran into Ross near the print shop," one of her coworkers was saying. "He's always so chill, you know? Just strolling around like he's got all the time in the world." Another voice chimed in. "I saw him in the break room just now. He was talking to Janet about the new hires. It's amazing how down-to-earth he is, considering how huge Givens Corp has become." Laura groaned softly, sinking deeper into her chair. Of course. Of course Ross had been in the break room while she was buried under emails in her office. The break room was only 2 doors down from her, but somehow she had missed him again. Her phone buzzed on her desk, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a text from Adam. "You missed him again. Ross was just here. LMAO." Laura rolled her eyes and typed back a quick reply. "Seriously? I was in the office the whole time." A few seconds later, Adam's response came through. "It's official. You're cursed." Laura couldn't help but laugh despite her exasperation. The Givens curse had become such a running joke that even she had started to find the humor in it. But still, there was a small part of her that felt a growing frustration. She was a professional after all, and meeting Ross wasn't just about curiosity. It was about making an impression, proving that she belonged at Givens Corp. Determined to break the curse, Laura decided she'd take matters into her own hands. She would make sure to be at the next big meeting early, prepared, and ready to meet Ross no matter what. There would be no distractions, no last-minute phone calls, No impromptu emergencies that would pull her away at the exact wrong moment. As the day of the meeting arrived, Laura woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. She chose her outfit with care, a sharp, tailored navy blue suit that exuded confidence and professionalism. She reviewed her notes twice, practiced her opening remarks, and even made a mental checklist of questions she wanted to ask Ross when they finally met. Arriving at the office a full hour early, Laura made her way up to the conference room, the same one where she'd missed Ross in the last meeting. She smiled to herself, feeling a strange sense of excitement. Today was going to be different. Today, she would break the Givens curse. The conference room was already set up, the long glass table gleaming under the bright overhead lights. The chairs were perfectly aligned, each place marked with a name card and a small notepad. Laura chose a seat near the middle of the table. Strategic, she thought. Not too close to seem eager, but not too far to be overlooked. As the minutes ticked by, other attendees started to trickle in. Janet from HR arrived first, greeting Laura with a warm smile. Bradley Hendricks, the CEO of Printest, entered shortly after, nodding in acknowledgement as he took his seat at the head of the table. Laura glanced at the door, waiting for Ross to appear. Her heart beat a little faster with each passing moment. Any minute now, she thought. She could practically picture him walking through the door, introducing himself, shaking her hand. It would be a brief exchange, just enough to finally put a face to the name that had loomed so large over her time at Givens Corp. The room continued to fill with the quiet chatter of colleagues exchanging updates on their various projects, but Laura kept her eyes on the door. She wasn't going to miss him this time. And then, at precisely 5 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start, Nancy walked into the room, her expression oddly apologetic. Laura's stomach dropped. She knew that look. She had seen it before. "Sorry, everyone," Nancy said, her voice calm but resigned. "Ross had to step out at the last minute. He got pulled into an emergency call with one of our international partners." There was a collective sigh around the room, but most of the attendees took the news in stride. They nodded understandingly, as if this were a normal occurrence. No big deal. But for Laura, it was the final straw. "Are you kidding me?" she thought, barely managing to keep her frustration from showing on her face. "Again?" She plastered on a polite smile, but inside, she was screaming. How was it possible? How could she have missed him again? She had been here, on time, prepared, and yet, Ross was still a no-show. The meeting continued as usual, with Bradley leading the discussion and Janet offering her insights on the staffing plans for the Printest acquisition. Laura contributed when appropriate, her voice steady and professional, but underneath her calm exterior, she was seething. It had become a running gag now, but it was hard to laugh when it felt like she was cursed. As the meeting wrapped up, Laura gathered her things, determined not to let her frustration show. She nodded and smiled at her colleagues, exchanging a few pleasantries as they left the room. But inside, she was already plotting her next move. She wasn't going to let this happen again. The Givens curse had to be broken. She stepped out of the conference room and made her way back to her office, her heels clicking purposefully against the polished floors. The office was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of conversations or the soft ding of the elevator in the distance. She felt her phone buzz again in her pocket and pulled it out. It was a text from Adam. "OMG. You missed him again, didn't you?" Laura groaned aloud, typing back a quick response. "How does this keep happening?" Adam's reply came almost instantly. "You're cursed. Just accept it." Laura couldn't help but laugh, though it was tinged with the edge of exasperation. The Givens curse had officially become a part of her Givens Corp experience, and at this rate, it seemed like she might never actually meet the man. She dropped into her chair and stared at her desk for a moment, feeling both defeated and oddly amused. Maybe Adam was right. Maybe she was cursed. But it wasn't over yet. Laura wasn't the type to give up easily, and she certainly wasn't going to let this absurd series of near misses define her time at Givens Corp. Tomorrow was another day after all, and sooner or later, Ross Givens wouldn't be able to avoid her forever. With a determined smile, Laura opened her laptop and got back to work, her mind already racing with ideas for her next attempt to finally meet the elusive Ross Givens. Part 2. Remembering Hank. The front door of Laura's apartment clicked shut behind her as she stepped inside, letting the weight of the day slowly slip from her shoulders. She dropped her keys onto the small table near the entrance, the familiar clink of metal against wood grounding her as she closed her eyes for a moment, taking a long, deep breath. The soft hum of the city outside was muffled by the thick walls, but even that distant noise seemed far away now. Inside her home, it was quiet, so quiet that it sometimes felt oppressive. The apartment was neat, minimalist, reflecting Laura's need for order amidst the chaos of her professional life. The gray sofa, the glass coffee table, the simple artwork that hung on the walls, all of it was designed for peace, for space, for clarity. But tonight, as on many nights, that clarity was tainted by the undercurrent of something much deeper. A quiet ache, an emptiness that filled the spaces the decor couldn't reach. Laura let out a slow sigh and moved toward the small sideboard near the window, where a few framed photographs sat. Most of them were of her and Sam, her husband, from years ago, happy moments captured in time. But the one that stood out to her, the one she always gravitated toward, was a photo that felt almost too sacred to touch. Her fingers hovered above the frame before she gently picked it up, her thumb grazing the edges of the worn picture. It was a small photo of her son, Hank, his bright smile lighting up the frame. He looked so alive in that photo. His tousled hair, his wide, mischievous eyes, the faint dimples on his cheeks. She could almost hear his laughter in the stillness of the room, the way his voice used to fill the house with that boundless energy only a child could have. Hank had been 7 when the accident happened. 7 years old, full of life and promise, with an imagination that never seemed to rest. He had loved to run, to chase the family dog through the backyard, to explore every corner of their world, like it was his personal playground. And he had loved her with a fierceness that sometimes caught Laura off guard. LYM, he had scribbled on the back of the photo in his clumsy handwriting. It was their little code, a secret phrase only the two of them shared. Laura turned the photo over in her hands, the letters etched into the back of the paper, LYM. She had always thought they were endearing, those 3 little letters that held so much meaning between them. Hank used to say it all the time, his voice bubbling with enthusiasm. But that phrase, that code, "Love you, Mom," had taken on a different resonance after the accident. The accident. The thought came unbidden, creeping into her mind like a shadow that refused to leave. No matter how hard she tried to focus on the good memories, on Hank's laughter, his boundless energy, the accident was always there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to pull her under. She sank onto the couch, the photograph still cradled in her hands, and stared at it, willing herself not to go back to that day. Not tonight. But it was too late. The memories, as they always did, came rushing in, sharp and unforgiving. It had been a bright, sunny afternoon, the kind of day where nothing bad was supposed to happen. She and Hank had been driving home from the park, Hank still chattering excitedly in the back seat about the game they'd played, about how fast he could run now. Laura remembered glancing at him in the rearview mirror, seeing his face lit up with that same wide grin he always wore after a fun day out. And then, chaos. The sound of screeching tires, the sudden impact, the world tilting on its axis as the car spun out of control. The screams, her own, Hank's, had filled the air, a sound so primal, so terrifying, that it still echoed in her nightmares. The world had gone black for a moment, the air thick with smoke and the sharp smell of burning rubber. And when she had woken up, the silence had been deafening. "Hank!" she had screamed, her voice hoarse, her body pinned by the weight of the airbag. "Hank!" But there had been no answer. Laura closed her eyes now, gripping the photograph tighter in her hands. Her heart clenched as the familiar wave of grief washed over her, raw and relentless. She could still feel the panic, the desperation, as she had tried to reach him, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. She had never felt so powerless in her life. When the paramedics arrived, it was too late. They had tried. She knew that. They had worked tirelessly, their voices urgent and steady as they pulled her out of the wreckage, as they tried to revive Hank. But there was nothing they could do. Nothing anyone could do. And Hank was gone. Laura exhaled, her breath shaky as she blinked back the tears that had gathered in her eyes. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry tonight. Not again. But the pain was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for moments like this to claw its way back up. The apartment felt too quiet now, the silence almost oppressive. She set the photograph down gently on the coffee table and leaned back into the cushions, staring up at the ceiling as the memories continued to swirl around her. She could hear Hank's voice in her head, the way he used to say LYM every time he ran out the door for school, every time they said goodnight. "Love you, Mom," he would say so effortlessly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then, without warning, she heard it again. His voice. Lim. The sound was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It was the voice of her son, clear and distinct, as though he were standing right next to her. Laura's eyes flew open, her heart pounding in her chest as she sat up, looking around the room. But there was no one there. Just the empty apartment, the dim glow of the city lights filtering through the window, casting long shadows across the walls. It wasn't the first time she had heard it. The whisper, the disembodied voice that seemed to come from nowhere, had haunted her ever since the accident. It always came at the quietest moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, when the memories of Hank were too close, too raw. "Liam," it would whisper, as if Hank were still here, still trying to reach out to her from somewhere beyond. Laura pressed her hands to her face, willing herself to calm down. She knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. It was just her mind playing tricks on her grief manifesting in ways she couldn't control. But even as she told herself that, a part of her wanted to believe that it was real, that somehow Hank was still with her, still watching over her, still whispering Lim in her ear whenever she needed him the most. She stood up, the photograph still lying on the table, and moved toward the window, staring out at the city below. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting a soft glow over the empty streets. The world felt so vast, so endless, and yet in this moment, Laura felt incredibly small, as though she were adrift in an ocean of grief that stretched as far as the eye could see. "Lim," the voice whispered again, so faint that she almost thought she had imagined it, but she hadn't. Laura rested her hand against the cool glass of the window, her heart aching with the familiar pain of loss. She had heard people say that grief lessened with time, that it became easier to bear. But that wasn't true. Not for her. The pain was always there, a constant companion, woven into the fabric of her being. She would never stop missing Hank. She would never stop loving him. And maybe that was why she heard him now, even though she knew he was gone. His love was still with her, even in the quiet moments, even when the world felt too heavy to bear. Laura closed her eyes, letting the silence wash over her, and for a moment, she could almost feel Hank's presence beside her, like a warm embrace that held her together even as everything else threatened to fall apart. "Love you, Mom," his voice echoed in her mind, as soft and as real as it had ever been. And in the stillness of the night, Laura let herself believe, just for a moment, that he was still with her. Chapter 6. Printest Project Preparations. Part 1. Deeper into the project. Laura sat at her desk, fingers gliding over her keyboard, the faint glow of her computer screen illuminating her face as she reviewed the latest financial reports from Printest. The numbers swirled in front of her, but they made sense, each column and row forming a clear picture of the project's trajectory. This was her element, her world of data and analysis, where everything had an order, a purpose. She had been working closely with Bradley Hendricks, the CEO of Printest, and Jared, his director of operations, to finalize the integration plans for the acquisition of HADS, the printer manufacturer. It was an ambitious project, one that required not only attention to detail, but also an understanding of the broader market strategy. Laura had been spending late nights and early mornings fine-tuning the data, double-checking projections, and preparing for meetings with the Printest team. On paper, everything was progressing well. But beneath the surface, there was tension. Tension that had been simmering ever since she'd started working more closely with Mindy Dawson, the MRT supervisor who had originally vied for Laura's position. Laura exhaled softly, leaning back in her chair and rubbing her temples. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mindy was out to undermine her, even though it was all done so subtly that it barely registered as sabotage. It wasn't blatant. Mindy was too smart for that. No, she did it in small, nearly imperceptible ways, sending incomplete data sets, forgetting to copy Laura on important emails, or casually dropping comments in meetings that made Laura seem less prepared than she was. Mindy always maintained a professional front, her smile never faltering, her tone always pleasant. But there was something underneath it all, a sharpness, a quiet hostility that lurked just beneath the surface. It was as though Mindy was determined to prove that Laura didn't belong here, that she had been the wrong choice for the job. Laura stared at the screen, her eyes narrowing slightly. She had just noticed a discrepancy in one of the financial reports, a small error in the data that had thrown off the entire forecast for the upcoming quarter. She double-checked the numbers, her fingers moving swiftly across the keys, and there it was again. An error in the data that Mindy had provided. Coincidence? Maybe. But Laura wasn't naive enough to believe that this was an innocent mistake. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Laura?" Jared's voice came from the hallway, followed by a light tap on the doorframe. Laura looked up, her eyes meeting Jared's as he stepped into her office. Jared was in his mid-30s, with neatly combed dark hair and a sharp, tailored suit that matched his no-nonsense demeanor. He had a calm, analytical presence, much like Laura, and she appreciated the fact that he never wasted time with unnecessary small talk. "Hey, Jared," Laura said, closing the report on her screen and gesturing for him to come in. "What's up?" Jared entered, carrying a stack of documents under one arm, his expression serious. "I wanted to go over a few things before the meeting tomorrow with Bradley," he said, setting the documents down on her desk. "There are some concerns about the staffing integration, especially when it comes to HADS's middle management. We need to make sure the transition is as seamless as possible." Laura nodded, already pulling up the relevant files on her computer. She had anticipated this. The integration wasn't just about numbers, it was about people, about ensuring that the employees from HADS felt secure in their new roles at Printest. Displacing too many key staff members could disrupt the company culture, and that was the last thing they needed during such a critical acquisition. "Yeah, I've been looking into that," Laura said, scrolling through the staffing charts on her screen. "We're anticipating some overlap in the management structure, which could lead to redundancies, but I think we can mitigate that with careful planning. I've put together a proposal for how we can integrate the teams without causing too much disruption." Jared leaned in, glancing at the screen as Laura walked him through her proposal. He nodded thoughtfully, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of her desk as he listened. "This looks solid," he said after a moment, his tone approving. "Bradley's going to like this. You've covered all the bases." Laura allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. It was always good to hear positive feedback from Jared. He was known for being meticulous and tough to impress, so knowing that she had his support gave her confidence going into the meeting with Bradley. As Jared picked up the stack of papers he'd brought and prepared to leave, he paused, glancing back at Laura. "By the way, I wanted to ask, did you get the updated market analysis from Mindy?" Laura blinked, her expression shifting slightly as she realized what Jared was asking. "No, I haven't seen it yet. She hasn't sent it over." Jared frowned, clearly confused. "She told me she'd sent it to you this morning." Laura's stomach tightened with frustration. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. "I'll follow up with her," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "Thanks for letting me know." Jared nodded, giving her a quick smile before heading back to his office. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, Laura exhaled sharply, feeling the familiar stir of anger in her chest. It was always something with Mindy, always these little, seemingly inconsequential actions that added up to bigger problems. If Jared hadn't mentioned the report, Laura would have walked into the meeting unprepared, and Mindy would have come out looking like the star. She wasn't going to let that happen. Without wasting another moment, Laura opened her email and fired off a quick message to Mindy, asking for the updated market analysis. She kept the tone polite, professional, but there was no mistaking the underlying urgency in her words. She couldn't afford to let this slip through the cracks. As she hit send, Laura sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, waiting for the reply that she knew would come. Probably an apology from Mindy, claiming she had simply forgotten to include Laura on the email. Or maybe she'd say the file had gotten lost in her outbox, or that it was sent to the wrong person. There was always an excuse, always some reason why these things kept happening. But Laura wasn't going to let Mindy get to her. Not today. As she waited for the response, she glanced out of the large window beside her desk. The view from Givens Corp was breathtaking, especially at this time of day. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the city skyline. The streets below bustled with life, the honking of horns and distant chatter barely audible from her office. It was moments like this that reminded Laura why she was here, why she had fought so hard to get this job. She loved the challenge, the opportunity to make a real impact, and she wasn't about to let Mindy undermine her efforts. A soft ping from her computer pulled her attention back to the screen. There it was, Mindy's reply. Laura opened the email, her eyes narrowing as she read the message. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Laura. I thought I had sent this over earlier. Here's the file. Let me know if you need anything else. Thanks." Laura's fingers tightened on the mouse. There it was, the same passive-aggressive oops that Mindy always used. The bright, cheerful tone, the smiley face at the end of the message, all meant to disarm, to make Laura feel like she was overreacting. But Laura wasn't fooled. She knew exactly what Mindy was doing. Opening the attachment, Laura quickly scanned the report, making sure the data was accurate and up to date. The numbers seemed fine, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Mindy had purposely delayed sending it, knowing that it would put Laura in a tough spot. She sighed, closing the email and making a mental note to keep an even closer eye on Mindy moving forward. This wasn't going to stop. Mindy was too ambitious, too competitive to let Laura succeed without a fight. But Laura had faced challenges before, much harder ones than this. She wasn't going to let someone like Mindy stand in her way. As the evening light faded and the office grew quieter, Laura focused on preparing for tomorrow's meeting. She worked late into the night, reviewing every detail, making sure she was ready for whatever questions Bradley might throw her way. By the time she finally left the office, the building was nearly empty, the lights dimmed, and the hallways quiet. As she walked through the empty corridors, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors, Laura felt a sense of determination settle over her. Tomorrow, she would go into that meeting prepared. She would stand her ground, no matter what Mindy tried to pull. She had earned her place at Givens Corp, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. With that thought in mind, Laura stepped into the elevator and watched as the doors slid shut in front of her. The soft hum of the elevator filled the air as it descended, and for the first time all day, Laura allowed herself to relax. The day had been long, the challenges had been many, but she was ready for whatever came next. The Givens Corp building disappeared behind her as she stepped out into the cool night air, the city alive with lights and movement. Laura took a deep breath, the fresh air filling her lungs as she turned toward the street. She would face tomorrow with the same calm determination that had carried her through so many other trials. And no matter what, she wasn't going to let Mindy win. Part 2. Subtle Observations. Mindy Dawson stood in the hallway just outside the conference room, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched Laura stride confidently down the corridor toward the meeting. There was something about the way Laura carried herself that always seemed to irritate Mindy, a kind of quiet assurance that Mindy found hard to pin down. Laura never seemed flustered, never seemed out of place, even when the pressure was mounting. And that annoyed Mindy. Mindy leaned against the wall, her arms folded over her chest as she feigned interest in the documents she was holding, her sharp gaze following Laura's every movement. Laura passed by without noticing her, too focused on whatever was running through her mind. But as she moved, Mindy caught something. Just a small detail, but enough to make her pause. It was the way Laura's head tilted ever so slightly as she walked, as though she were listening for something beyond the usual office sounds. Her steps were always precise, always perfectly measured, even when she wasn't looking directly at where she was going. And then there was the way Laura handled objects, the way her fingers seemed to linger just a fraction longer than necessary when she reached for her phone or a file, as though she were feeling for something, mapping out the space around her in a way that was far too deliberate. Mindy's eyes narrowed further as she tucked the documents under her arm, her mind racing. There was something familiar about Laura's movements, something that reminded her of someone she knew intimately. Her brother. Mindy's younger brother, James, had been born blind. Growing up, she had watched him learn to navigate the world in ways that no one else in their family could fully understand. He used his other senses in ways that Mindy had never thought possible. His hearing was sharp, his sense of touch highly refined. She had seen him develop subtle skills over the years, like the way he used sound to orient himself, or the way he could sense objects without ever touching them. It was like he had a sixth sense, an ability to see without his eyes. Mindy watched Laura disappear into the conference room, her thoughts swirling. The way Laura moved, the way she listened. It was so much like James. Too much like James to be a coincidence. But that didn't make any sense. Laura wasn't blind. She moved through the office with ease, worked her computer without hesitation, and handled documents like anyone else. There was no reason for Mindy to think otherwise. And yet, there had been little things, subtle things that Mindy hadn't noticed until now. Laura rarely looked directly at people when they spoke, even in one-on-one conversations. She often tilted her head to the side, as though relying more on sound than sight. And she had an uncanny ability to navigate crowded spaces without bumping into anyone, even when it seemed like she wasn't fully paying attention to her surroundings. It was almost as though she could see without actually looking. Mindy shook her head, pushing the thought away. It was ridiculous. There was no way Laura could be blind. She would have noticed something like that before now. But even as she dismissed the idea, the seed of doubt had already been planted, and it gnawed at her quietly. She straightened up, her mind shifting back to the task at hand. It didn't matter if Laura had some kind of unusual skill or not. Mindy wasn't about to let her suspicions get in the way of her plan. Laura had taken the position that should have been hers, and that wasn't something Mindy could easily forget. No matter how good Laura was at her job, Mindy would find a way to sabotage her. Quietly, of course. No one could know what she was doing, least of all Laura. Mindy walked down the hallway toward her own office, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. As she passed the glass walls of the other offices, she caught glimpses of her colleagues, some engrossed in phone calls, others typing furiously at their desks. Everyone seemed so absorbed in their own world, oblivious to the small battles being fought behind the scenes. When she reached her office, Mindy sat down at her desk and pulled up the latest project reports. She stared at the screen, her mind racing as she thought about her next move. It wasn't enough to simply delay emails or send incomplete data. Those tricks were becoming too obvious, and Laura had already caught on to a few of them. No, Mindy needed to be smarter, more subtle. She opened her email and began composing a message, her fingers moving quickly over the keys. The message was to Jared, Mr. Hendricks's director of operations. Mindy kept the tone professional, respectful, but she inserted just the right amount of doubt about Laura's handling of the project. She mentioned a minor concern about the accuracy of one of the financial forecasts Laura had presented, suggesting that it might need another review before tomorrow's meeting. It was a harmless enough comment, just a suggestion, but it planted the idea that maybe Laura wasn't as thorough as she seemed. Satisfied, Mindy hit send and leaned back in her chair, watching the email disappear into her outbox. It wasn't much, but it was enough to chip away at Laura's credibility, piece by piece. And that was how Mindy operated, slowly, carefully, never doing anything overt that could be traced back to her. She glanced at her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen as she debated whether to call her brother. She hadn't spoken to James in a few weeks, and the thought of him now, of his skills, of how he had learned to navigate the world without sight, made her feel strangely conflicted. She knew what it was like to watch someone adapt, to see them develop abilities that defied expectations. But Laura wasn't like James. She couldn't be. Mindy tapped the edge of her phone, her thoughts swirling as she replayed her observations of Laura over the past few weeks. The way she moved, the way she listened, the way she seemed to always know what was around her, even when her eyes weren't focused on anything in particular. It was uncanny. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Mindy?" Nancy's voice came from the hallway, her head peeking in through the partially open door. "Got a minute to go over the staffing plans?" Mindy snapped back to the present, pushing her thoughts about Laura to the back of her mind. "Sure, come on in," she said, forcing a smile as she waved Nancy inside. As Nancy entered, Mindy felt the familiar rhythm of office life return. The conversation flowed easily. The discussion focused on the project, on the numbers, on the details that mattered. But even as she spoke, Mindy couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of unease at the back of her mind. It wasn't just Laura's abilities that were bothering her. It was the fact that Mindy couldn't quite figure her out. Laura was too calm, too composed, too controlled. And in a world where control meant power, Laura seemed to have an edge that Mindy couldn't quite understand. As Nancy droned on about the latest staffing updates, Mindy's mind wandered back to her brother. She thought about the countless times she had watched him navigate unfamiliar spaces, using his cane and his other senses to guide him. She thought about the way he had developed skills that allowed him to function in a sighted world, skills that most people would never notice unless they were paying close attention. Was that what Laura was doing? Was there something more going on behind her professional facade, something that no one else had noticed? Mindy's eyes flicked to the clock on her desk, watching the seconds tick by as Nancy continued talking. She wasn't ready to confront her suspicions yet. She wasn't ready to believe that there was something more to Laura than what met the eye. But the idea lingered, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts, refusing to be dismissed entirely. By the time Nancy left her office, Mindy had made up her mind. She would keep watching Laura, observing her more closely, looking for more signs. And if there was something to her suspicions, if Laura really was hiding something, Mindy would find a way to use it to her advantage. For now, though, she would continue her subtle sabotage, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of their colleagues. Laura might have the upper hand for now, but Mindy was patient. She knew how to play the long game. And in the end, she would come out on top. Chapter 7. Another Near Miss. Part 1. The Fire Alarm. Laura sat in the conference room, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of her tablet as she glanced at the clock on the wall. The meeting was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes, and once again, Ross Givens was supposed to attend. This time, she could feel it. Today was the day. The infamous Givens curse, as Adam liked to call it, would finally be broken. She was going to meet the man who had been eluding her for weeks. Her anticipation was palpable, a mixture of excitement and exasperation bubbling just beneath the surface. She had come so close to meeting Ross several times before, only to have fate snatch the opportunity away at the last possible second. But not today. Today, she had planned every detail down to the minute. She had arrived early, prepared her presentation meticulously, and now all that was left to do was wait. The conference room was bright and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling city below. Sunlight streamed in, casting long shadows across the polished glass table. Laura could hear the distant hum of the office outside, the soft murmur of conversations, and the occasional ringing of phones. But in here, it was quiet. Too quiet, almost. Jared was already seated across from her, flipping through his notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't seem concerned about the timing of the meeting, though Laura had noticed him glancing at his phone once or twice. She assumed he was waiting for an update from Ross. Bradley Hendricks, the CEO of Printest, hadn't arrived yet, but that wasn't unusual. Bradley was notorious for showing up just before the start of any meeting, composed and ready to dive in. Laura's eyes darted toward the door, her heart racing as the seconds ticked by. She forced herself to focus on her tablet, scrolling through her presentation one more time. The data was solid. She knew that. Everything about this project had been carefully planned, from the financial forecasts to the staffing integrations. But this meeting wasn't just about numbers. It was about finally meeting Ross Givens, the man who had become something of a phantom in her life. As she stared at the screen, her mind drifted to all the stories she had heard about Ross. People described him as a visionary, a genius who had built Givens Corp from the ground up. He was known for his ability to spot opportunities where others saw obstacles, and his calm, almost zen-like demeanor was something people often admired. But to Laura, Ross was more of a mystery than anything else. She had never even seen his face, and yet his presence loomed over every aspect of her work. Her phone buzzed softly, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. A message from Adam. "Good luck today. If you don't meet him this time, I'm calling it. You're actually cursed." Ha ha ha. Laura rolled her eyes, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Today's the day. I can feel it. She texted back quickly, slipping her phone into her bag. Just then, Jared's phone buzzed loudly on the table, drawing both their attention. He picked it up, glanced at the screen, and smiled slightly before looking up at Laura. Ross just texted, Jared said, his voice casual. He's 2 minutes out. We're finally going to see him today. Laura's pulse quickened. She couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. 2 minutes. That was nothing. She could already picture him walking through the door, shaking her hand, finally putting an end to this absurd game of near misses. Jared stood up and moved toward the door, his phone still in his hand. I'm going to grab Bradley, he said over his shoulder. He's probably on his way up. Sure, Laura replied, her voice steady, though inside she felt like her nerves were on fire. She stood as well, smoothing down her skirt and taking a deep breath. 2 minutes. That was all it would take. She was ready. As Jared stepped out into the hallway, Laura walked over to the window, her fingers grazing the cool glass as she looked out at the skyline. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue over the city. It was beautiful, but she couldn't fully appreciate it, not with her thoughts so completely consumed by the impending moment. And then, the door opened behind her. Laura spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. But it wasn't Ross. It was Bradley Hendricks, striding into the room with his usual air of authority, a confident smile on his face. Laura, he greeted her warmly, extending his hand. Good to see you. You too, Bradley, Laura replied, shaking his hand, trying not to let her disappointment show. Ross wasn't far behind, she reminded herself. Any second now. Bradley glanced around the room, his sharp eyes scanning the space. Jared mentioned Ross is on his way? He asked, his tone casual but expectant. Yeah, he should be here any minute now, Laura said, trying to sound nonchalant, though her nerves were buzzing. Bradley nodded, his attention already shifting to his phone. He typed something quickly, then slipped it into his pocket as he moved to take a seat at the head of the table. Let's get started once he arrives. Laura nodded and sat down as well, her fingers tightening around the edge of her tablet. Any minute now. She could feel the anticipation building in the room. Bradley seemed calm, but she noticed the way he kept glancing at the door. Jared reappeared a moment later, giving Bradley a quick nod before taking his seat. There was a stillness in the air now, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for Ross to walk through that door. Laura shifted in her chair, resisting the urge to check her phone again. She didn't want to seem impatient, but the suspense was killing her. And then, it happened. The fire alarm. A shrill, piercing sound filled the room, echoing off the glass walls and sending a jolt of shock through Laura's body. Her first instinct was confusion, followed quickly by disbelief. Of all the things that could go wrong at this moment, a fire alarm was the last thing she had expected. Bradley groaned, rubbing his temples as the sound continued to blare. Jared was already on his feet, heading for the door. I'll check what's going on, Jared called over the noise, his voice barely audible above the alarm. Laura stood as well, her heart racing as she tried to process what was happening. The noise was deafening, and it was impossible to think clearly. Her mind scrambled, trying to make sense of the situation. They had been so close. Ross had been just outside. She was sure of it. Bradley glanced at his phone again, his expression tightening. Ross just texted. He's stuck in the stairwell. Looks like he has another appointment after this, so he's not going to make it. Laura felt her stomach drop. Not going to make it? After all this? She could barely believe it. The fire alarm had ruined everything. We should evacuate, Bradley said, standing up and motioning for her to follow. Come on, let's get out of here before it gets worse. Laura nodded numbly, gathering her things as she tried to suppress the surge of frustration rising within her. This couldn't be happening. Not again. They had been so close. So close. And now Ross was gone. Again. As they stepped out into the hallway, joining the steady stream of employees making their way toward the emergency exits, Laura couldn't help but feel a bitter sense of irony. The Givens curse was real. There was no other explanation. She walked beside Bradley and Jared, her mind buzzing with disbelief. The fire alarm continued to wail, adding to the chaos as they descended the stairwell, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Jared glanced at her, his expression sympathetic. "We'll catch him next time, Laura. Don't worry." But Laura wasn't so sure. She had thought the same thing so many times before, only to have something go wrong at the last second. By the time they reached the lobby, the fire alarm had finally stopped, though the building's fire marshals were still instructing people to remain outside while they conducted safety checks. Laura stood off to the side, her arms crossed over her chest as she stared up at the building, trying to process what had just happened. "Unbelievable," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. Bradley stood beside her, checking his phone again. "Ross had to leave," he said, confirming what Laura had already feared. "Something came up. He'll catch up with us next week." Laura forced a tight smile. "Of course." As the minutes ticked by, the tension in her chest eased slightly, replaced by a tired resignation. It was almost comical now, how close she had come to meeting Ross, only to have something, anything, get in the way. The fire alarm had been the perfect twist in this absurd saga, and yet deep down, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that this near miss wasn't the last. Somehow, she knew that when she finally did meet Ross Givens, it would be under entirely different circumstances that she couldn't yet imagine. But for now, all she could do was laugh at the absurdity of it all, even as she quietly steeled herself for whatever might come next. Part 2. The Weight of Silence. The soft glow of the afternoon sun filtered through the conference room windows as Laura sat opposite Bradley Hendricks, the CEO of Printest International. The meeting had started off as planned, just the two of them going over the final stages of the Printest project, discussing strategies, reviewing numbers, and mapping out the next steps for the acquisition of HADS. But as the conversation drifted toward the more personal aspects of the integration, the impact on families, employees, and the broader community, Laura noticed a subtle change in Bradley's demeanor. It wasn't something obvious. Most people wouldn't have caught it. But Laura, who had spent years perfecting the art of observation, saw the signs immediately. His posture stiffened slightly, his shoulders pulled back just a little too tight. He averted his gaze when she mentioned the potential effects on employees with young children or those who might be dealing with personal hardships. The moment she brought up the word family, Bradley's eyes clouded, as though he were retreating into some distant place, far from the sterile boardroom they occupied. Laura wasn't sure what to make of it. She didn't know Bradley well on a personal level. No one in the office really did. He was known for being professional, efficient, and completely focused on the job. He ran Printest with precision, driving its success while keeping a cool, almost distant presence in meetings. But today, there was something else. A shadow of emotion that seemed to hover just beneath the surface of his usually calm exterior. She shifted slightly in her seat, turning the conversation back to the data on her tablet. "I think we should take another look at the employee retention strategy, especially for the middle management at HADS," Laura suggested, scrolling through the figures on the screen. "There's potential for redundancies, but we could mitigate that with a phased approach." Bradley nodded, but his response was slow, almost distracted. His gaze lingered on the window behind her, as though he were only half listening. He had been engaged just moments ago, discussing market trends and logistics with his usual sharpness, but now he seemed elsewhere, his mind a million miles away. Laura paused, lowering the tablet slightly. "Bradley?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. "Are you okay?" His eyes flicked back to her, and for a brief second, she saw something raw flash across his face, something that startled her. Guilt? Pain? It was hard to tell, but whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He cleared his throat, his usual composed expression sliding back into place like a well-worn mask. "Yeah," he said, his voice firm, though it lacked its usual energy. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Laura hesitated, unsure whether to push the issue. It wasn't her place to pry, but something about the way he was acting made her uneasy. Bradley Hendricks was a man who always had control. Control over the numbers, control over the boardroom, control over his emotions. To see that control slip, even for a moment, felt significant. Before she could decide what to say next, Bradley glanced down at his watch and shifted in his seat. "Let's move on to the financials for Q3, he said, his tone a little too brisk, as though he were eager to steer the conversation back to safer territory. "We'll need to present these numbers to Ross next week, and I want to make sure everything is airtight." Laura nodded, allowing the change in subject, though the tension still lingered in the room like a cloud that refused to dissipate. She knew better than to push too hard. Bradley was her superior, and whatever he was dealing with was clearly personal. If he didn't want to talk about it, that was his choice. Still, as she continued walking him through the figures on her screen, she couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on. The minutes ticked by as they worked through the reports, but the conversation had lost its earlier ease. Bradley answered her questions, offered input where needed, but the sharpness of his usual focus was gone. He seemed distracted, his mind wandering, and every so often, his gaze drifted back toward the window, as if something outside held more interest than the numbers in front of him. After nearly an hour of going over financials, Bradley finally stood, closing his laptop with a soft click. "I think that's enough for today," he said, his voice tight but polite. "You've done excellent work here, Laura. We'll pick this up again tomorrow." Laura stood as well, watching him as he gathered his things. "Thanks, Bradley," she said, offering a small smile. "I appreciate the feedback." He nodded, but his eyes were already distant, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, his steps quick and purposeful, as if he couldn't wait to escape the room. Laura remained where she was, her eyes following him as he disappeared down the hallway. Something wasn't right. She had seen this kind of reaction before, though not often. People shutting down, retreating when a particular subject was brought up. It was a kind of emotional armor, a defense mechanism against something too painful to confront. But what could it be? She had only mentioned families and children in the context of the acquisition, a standard part of any corporate integration. There was nothing out of the ordinary about it. Yet Bradley had reacted as if she had touched on something deeply personal, something that had struck a nerve. Laura gathered her tablet and papers, her mind still turning over the interaction as she walked back to her office. She didn't want to speculate. She hated making assumptions about people's personal lives, but it was hard not to wonder. Bradley's reaction had been too strong, too sudden to ignore. When she reached her desk, she set her things down and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts drifted to her own life, to her own losses. She understood grief, understood how it could bubble up at the most unexpected moments. But Bradley wasn't grieving, was he? There had been no talk of loss, no mention of family tragedies. As far as Laura knew, Bradley was focused on his work, just like everyone else at Givens Corp. A soft ping from her computer pulled her attention back to the present. She glanced at the screen and saw an email from Mindy, her stomach tightening instinctively. She didn't need to open it to know it was something trivial, some small attempt to undermine her work or make her look less prepared. Mindy's passive-aggressive tactics had become all too familiar lately, and Laura had learned to handle them with calm detachment. Opening the email, Laura scanned the message quickly. It was a reminder about a report that Laura had already submitted, Mindy's way of suggesting that Laura had forgotten something. With a small sigh, Laura deleted the email without responding. She wasn't going to let Mindy's games get to her today, not after the strange interaction with Bradley. But as she sat there, her mind returned to the mystery of Bradley's behavior. She didn't know why, but something about the way he had reacted gnawed at her. There had been a flash of pain in his eyes, a flicker of something that had nothing to do with business or spreadsheets. It was personal. Laura stood and walked over to the window, staring out at the city skyline as the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the buildings. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cool air from the vent brush against her skin. For a moment, her mind wandered back to Hank, her son. She thought about how grief had a way of creeping up on her, even on the calmest of days. There were moments, like now, when the memories would flood back and she'd be swept away by the weight of everything she had lost. But she had learned to live with it, to carry the grief with her without letting it consume her. Was Bradley carrying something similar? A loss that he couldn't quite shake? A guilt that he couldn't let go of? Laura shook her head. She was projecting, and she knew it. Bradley's life was his own, and whatever he was dealing with was none of her business. But still, she couldn't help but wonder. There was something about the way he had shut down, the way he had avoided her eyes when the topic of families and children came up. Something that reminded her of her own grief, her own attempts to keep the pain at bay. As she turned back to her desk, the weight of the day settled on her shoulders once again. Bradley's silence, his emotional distance. It wasn't her problem to solve, but it lingered in the back of her mind, a quiet question that refused to be answered. For now, she would focus on the work in front of her, on the things she could control. But as she left the office that evening, the memory of Bradley's expression stayed with her, a reminder that even in the world of high-powered business, everyone was carrying their own burdens, their own unspoken griefs, and some wounds she knew all too well, never truly healed. Chapter 8. Office Sabotage. Part 1. Subtle Shifts. Mindy Dawson stood at the doorway to her office, arms folded across her chest, watching Laura move through the open space of Givens Corp's sleek, modern offices. The faint hum of conversation and the tapping of keyboards filled the air, but Mindy was focused solely on Laura. It was something of a routine now, this quiet observation. At first, it had been purely out of annoyance. How did she get that job? How did she beat me for the position? But over the last few days, something else had begun to creep into Mindy's thoughts. Curiosity. There was something different about Laura, something that Mindy had started to notice in subtle, nearly imperceptible ways. The way Laura navigated the office, almost as if she were following an invisible map that no one else could see. The way she moved with such deliberate precision, never bumping into anything or anyone, even when she was clearly distracted. And the way she seemed to rely on her other senses, listening intently, her head tilting slightly, as though sound was more important to her than sight. Mindy shifted slightly, her gaze narrowing as she tracked Laura's progress across the room. Laura was heading toward one of the conference rooms, her posture as straight and confident as ever, her steps unhurried but sure. Nothing about her movements suggested any uncertainty, but there was still something there, something Mindy couldn't quite put her finger on. Her mind drifted back to her brother James. He had been born blind, and growing up, Mindy had watched him develop skills that amazed her. He had learned to navigate their home without hesitation, relying on sound and touch to orient himself. Over the years, James had grown so adept at moving through the world without sight that most people never even noticed his blindness. They just saw how effortlessly he moved, how in control he seemed. And now, watching Laura, Mindy couldn't help but feel a strange sense of familiarity. The way Laura moved, the way she seemed to see without looking, it was so much like James. Too much to ignore. But what did that mean? It didn't make sense. Laura wasn't blind. She couldn't be. No one in the office had ever suggested such a thing, and Laura had never given any indication that she had a vision impairment. She worked on her computer like everyone else, handled paperwork, and gave presentations with ease. There was no reason to think she couldn't see. And yet, Mindy's lips tightened into a thin line as she tried to make sense of it. She had been sabotaging Laura for weeks now, taking every opportunity to undermine her, whether it was through, accidentally, leaving her off important emails, sending her incorrect data, or subtly throwing her under the bus in meetings. At first, it had been easy. Laura never complained, never retaliated, and Mindy had assumed that she simply wasn't paying attention. But recently, something had shifted. Laura had started catching on, discreetly, without confrontation, but catching on nonetheless. She had begun to find ways around the missing information, had corrected the faulty data without making a scene, and had somehow managed to stay ahead of every trap Mindy set for her. It was infuriating, but more than that, it was confusing. How was Laura so good at anticipating her next move? How was she able to navigate these sabotages without ever slipping up? Mindy leaned against the doorframe, watching as Laura stopped near the entrance of the conference room and seemed to pause for a moment, her head tilting slightly as though she were listening for something. The motion was so small, so subtle, that no one else would have noticed. But Mindy saw it. Laura didn't look around the room, didn't glance over her shoulder to check who was nearby. Instead, she simply stood there for a beat longer than necessary, her hand grazing the doorframe lightly before she stepped inside. That was it. That was the moment that solidified Mindy's suspicions. The way Laura's hand had touched the doorframe, almost like she was using it to orient herself, reminded Mindy of how James used to run his fingers along the walls when he entered unfamiliar spaces. Laura had done it so casually, so seamlessly, that it could have easily been mistaken for nothing more than a simple gesture. But to Mindy, it was something else. It was a sign. Her curiosity deepened. With a quiet sigh, Mindy pushed herself away from the door and made her way back to her desk, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. She wasn't ready to confront Laura directly. There was no proof of anything, after all. But the signs were there, and they were getting harder to ignore. For now, though, Mindy would continue with her plan. She couldn't afford to lose focus. Whatever strange abilities Laura might have, whatever skills she was using to navigate the office, it didn't change the fact that Mindy wanted her position back. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let Laura get ahead of her. If anything, this new revelation only fueled Mindy's resolve. She would figure out what was going on with Laura, and she would use it to her advantage. Mindy sat down at her desk, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she composed a quick email to Jared. The email was straightforward, a suggestion that Laura had missed an important detail in one of her reports, even though Mindy knew that wasn't true. It was a small, almost inconsequential move, but it was enough to plant the seed of doubt. She hit send, leaning back in her chair with a satisfied smirk. This was how it would go. Small, subtle acts that chipped away at Laura's credibility, piece by piece. If Laura wanted to play this game, Mindy would play it better. But even as she tried to focus on her work, her thoughts kept drifting back to Laura. The way she moved, the way she listened, the way she seemed to have an unspoken awareness of everything around her, even when she wasn't looking. Mindy pulled up a report on her screen, but the words blurred as her mind continued to wander. She thought about the countless times she had seen James navigate their childhood home, his fingers lightly brushing against the walls, his ears always attuned to the smallest sounds, the creak of a floorboard, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. He had developed such finely tuned instincts that he rarely needed help. Most people had no idea he was blind until he told them. Was that what was happening with Laura? Was it possible that she was hiding something, just as James had learned to hide his blindness from the outside world? Mindy shook her head, pushing the thought away. It was ridiculous. Laura wasn't blind. There was no reason to believe that she was. And yet, she couldn't let it go. As the afternoon wore on, Mindy's curiosity grew stronger. She found herself glancing at Laura's office every time she passed by, watching for more signs, more clues that could confirm or deny her suspicions. But Laura gave nothing away. She worked quietly, efficiently, her attention always focused on the task at hand. If there was something more to her, she wasn't revealing it. By the end of the day, Mindy was no closer to an answer, but she had made up her mind about one thing. She was going to figure this out. Whether Laura was hiding something or not, Mindy was determined to uncover the truth. For now, though, she would continue with her plan, slowly chipping away at Laura's reputation while keeping her own suspicions to herself. There was no need to confront Laura just yet. Mindy needed more time, more information. But the game had changed, and Mindy was ready to play. As she gathered her things and headed for the elevator, she allowed herself one last glance at Laura's office. The door was closed, but through the glass she could see Laura at her desk, her head slightly tilted, her fingers brushing the edge of a file as though she were feeling its texture. Mindy's heart quickened. There was something there. She knew it, and one way or another, she was going to find out what it was. Part 2. Another near miss. Laura glanced at the clock on her screen, her heart racing as she realized she was running late for her next call. The conference room table was littered with papers, financial reports, project briefs, and meeting notes that had piled up over the course of the day. She hurriedly gathered them into a messy stack, slipping them into a folder with one hand while checking her phone with the other. Jared had texted her 5 minutes ago, reminding her that the client call was set to start in just a few minutes. Great, she muttered under her breath, standing up so fast that her chair rolled back a few inches, nearly hitting the wall behind her. She slung her bag over her shoulder, grabbed the folder, and dashed out of the conference room, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The hallways of Givens Corp buzzed with the usual mid-afternoon energy, the soft hum of conversations mixing with the clicking of keyboards and the occasional ringing phone. But Laura barely noticed. Her mind was entirely focused on the call she was about to take, her thoughts racing through the key points she needed to cover. The integration strategy with Printest was crucial, and missing even a small detail could throw the whole project off balance. As she rounded the corner, moving faster than she probably should have in heels, she collided headlong with someone coming from the opposite direction. The impact was sudden and jarring, sending papers flying everywhere, scattering like autumn leaves in the wind. Laura let out a small gasp of surprise, momentarily losing her balance as the force of the collision pushed her off course. "Oh my God, sorry," she exclaimed, dropping to her knees almost immediately to gather the scattered papers. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a wave of frustration washed over her. Of all the days to bump into someone, this had to be the worst possible moment. The man she had run into, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark suit, crouched down beside her without a word, quickly helping her scoop up the papers. His movements were efficient, his hands moving with practiced ease as he gathered the documents into a neat stack. Laura barely looked at him, too focused on retrieving the reports before they got trampled by other passing employees. "Here," the man said, his voice calm and composed, holding out the stack of papers toward her. "Thanks," Laura muttered, grabbing the papers without looking up. She stuffed them back into the folder, barely registering the man's presence as she scrambled to her feet. She could feel her cheeks flush with embarrassment, and her frustration only deepened. She barely spared him a second glance before she took off again, muttering under her breath about how late she was. "Sorry about that. I'm running late for a call." The man didn't say anything more. He just nodded, though Laura didn't even see that, before stepping aside to let her pass. She rushed past him, her heels clicking even more rapidly now as she sped down the hallway toward her office. By the time she reached her desk, she was breathless. She dropped into her chair, fumbled with her headset, and quickly dialed into the call, barely making it on time. She exhaled sharply, trying to center herself before speaking, her voice calm and professional despite the chaos that had just unfolded. The meeting went off without a hitch, at least as far as the client was concerned. Laura managed to keep her composure, guiding the discussion smoothly through the details of the acquisition strategy, addressing concerns, and presenting solutions. But the entire time, she couldn't shake the lingering frustration from the earlier collision. When the call finally ended, she slumped back in her chair, letting out a long breath. She rubbed her temples, trying to ease the tension that had built up over the course of the afternoon. What a day. First, she had almost missed the call, then the papers, and to top it off, she'd nearly bowled someone over in the hallway. It wasn't like her to be so frazzled. She was usually calm, collected, and in control. But the pressure of the Printest project was getting to her, and now she had to deal with the added embarrassment of having knocked into someone and practically run away without even thanking him properly. Laura shook her head, letting out a small, humorless laugh. "What a mess," she muttered, closing her laptop and standing up. She decided to head to the break room for some water. Maybe a quick break would help clear her mind. As she made her way through the office, she caught sight of Adam leaning against one of the cubicles, chatting with Sharon from reception. He spotted her as she approached, and his face lit up with a wide grin. "Hey, Laura!" Adam called out, raising a hand in greeting. "Guess who I just ran into?" Laura raised an eyebrow, stopping in her tracks. "Who?" "Ross Givens," Adam replied, the name rolling off his tongue casually, as if it were no big deal. "He was in the hallway not too long ago. Actually, I think he was heading toward your side of the office." Laura's eyes widened, her stomach doing a somersault. "Wait, what?" "Yeah, he must have just been passing through," Adam said, shrugging as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "I saw him talking to a couple of people near the elevators." Laura felt her heart sink as realization dawned on her. The man she had bumped into, the one who had helped her gather her papers, had been Ross Givens. The Ross Givens. And she hadn't even looked up. She had just mumbled a quick, thanks, and rushed off like a maniac, completely oblivious to the fact that she had finally come face to face with the man she had been trying to meet for weeks. She blinked, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice somewhere between disbelief and exasperation. "That was Ross?" Adam chuckled, clearly amused by her reaction. "Yep. I mean, you couldn't have missed him. He was literally right there. Tall guy, dark suit. Ring any bells?" Laura's hand went to her forehead, rubbing it as if that would somehow erase the embarrassment of the entire encounter. "Oh my God," she muttered under her breath. "I didn't even realize." Sharon, who had been listening to the conversation with a bemused smile, chimed in. "Don't worry, Laura. Happens to the best of us. I've seen Ross pass through here a dozen times, and sometimes I don't even notice. He moves quick." Laura groaned inwardly. Of course this would happen. Another near miss. Another chance encounter with Ross Givens. And once again, she had completely blown it. Not only had she not realized who he was, but she had practically barreled into him, papers flying everywhere, before rushing off without so much as a proper acknowledgement. She could already hear Adam teasing her about it later, spinning the story into yet another joke about the Givens curse. "Well, that's just perfect," Laura said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I've been trying to meet the guy for weeks, and the one time I do, I don't even recognize him." Adam laughed, clearly enjoying her frustration. "Hey, look at it this way. You've officially met him now. That's progress, right?" "Sure," Laura replied, rolling her eyes. "If by progress you mean making a complete fool of myself." Sharon chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Don't beat yourself up, Laura. You'll get your chance. Ross is around more than you think. He's just elusive." "Yeah, well, he's a little too elusive for my liking," Laura muttered, crossing her arms in frustration. She couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. It was almost comical, the way she kept missing Ross by a hair, like the universe was playing some kind of cosmic joke on her. As she walked back to her office, the frustration slowly gave way to a sense of resignation. At this point, it was becoming a pattern, one that she was almost getting used to. Every time she thought she was about to meet Ross, something would get in the way. A fire alarm, a last-minute cancellation, or in today's case, her own obliviousness. But deep down, Laura knew that she couldn't let it bother her forever. Ross Givens might be a phantom in her professional life, but she was still doing her job, still handling the Printest project with the care and precision it deserved. If Ross had noticed her work, if he had seen anything in those papers they'd scattered across the hallway, maybe that was enough for now. Still, as she sat down at her desk, she couldn't help but shake her head at how close she had come. Yet again,